Well, Michael is from Wayne State University, and he is probably one of the top K-12 online learning researchers in the world. And I would say, in my estimation, he's probably the top young scholar in the world that's coming up, because some of the other ones, like Kathy and Mr. Clark and others, are at the sunset of their careers, or at least beyond the midpoint of their careers, while Michael's really at the beginning of his career, and he's done a lot of research for, you've only been out of university 6 years, right? So he's done an awful lot. He has a wide breadth of knowledge. And I'm just going to tell a quick anecdote. I had a chance to work with Michael on Abby Hawkins' dissertation committee. He was an external member on her committee. And Michael is a great mentor too. In fact, he's down here staying with Abby, visiting with her and doing some other stuff. But he was an awesome mentor to Abby. And I remember going to AECT once, and they essentially spent like a whole day at AECT cranking out one of her dissertation articles, getting the final work done on one of her dissertation articles. And I was like, I mentored Abby. I feel like I was a good mentor for Abby, but that was beyond the call of duty, to spend a whole day at a conference
Actually,
helping.
it was 5 days we would meet for each of the meals, and then we'd meet around 10 o'clock at night. And she handed me one draft, and I'd hand her another. I'd hand her the last draft back with all these red marks on it, and she'd go back. And we did that for the 4.5 days of the conference, and for 2 or 3, it was done by the time we left.
And I think she was really using the conference as kind of a getaway, right, from work.
She went to, I think, 2 sessions in total. Both she presented at, and the rest of the time she was in her hotel room writing her dissertation.
So anyway, let's give, what I've asked Michael to do, it's really going to be quite informal. He's going to spend about 15 minutes presenting up front, and I want the bulk of this time to really be a time where we can ask questions and engage in a rich, deep discussion about K-12 online learning. So most of the people in here have read those 2 kind of seminal pieces of yours, or most influential pieces of yours. Not all have, but most have. And so let's welcome Michael with a round of applause.
Thanks much. Charles basically just asked that I sort of, give a quick little state of, where we are in K-12 online learning, then a quick comment on where I think we're going, and then we can just chat for a bit. So I'm not even sure if I'll take the full 15 minutes.
That's fine. Anyway.
Just takes a few minutes. When you look at online learning, there's been a lot that's been written about it, and one of the unfortunate things is that it's this hype that's been built around online learning that has really caused the kinds of increases that we're seeing. Right now you've got online learning being required in some way, shape, or form in about 9 different states, and then there's also a Canadian province that's considering doing something similar. You've got activity in all 50 states. The numbers, depending on who you ask, range anywhere from 1.5 million students involved to a high of 6 million students. And if you're curious, 6 million students represent about 12% of the K-12 population. To give you, I guess, a sort of a trail on that, Tom Clark in 2001, I think, in his second State of the States report estimated that there was about 40 or 50,000. So we're looking at about 12 years and gone from 40 or 50,000 to somewhere between 1.5 and 6 million. So that growth has been quite exponential. Just in case you're wondering, the 1 million, actually 1.7, comes from the Department of Education. INACOL says between 2 and 3 million. Ambient Insights, who's a market research group for businesses, says 6 million. So that'll give you a sense as to, where the numbers are coming from and maybe some of the motivation behind it. Charles, yeah?
Do you mind if we ask
Go right
questions
ahead,
as you're
yeah.
doing this too? I'm just wondering if that number actually represents students that are in virtual schools, that is, that their entire curriculum is online, or if those numbers really represent students who may be doing a lot of their work in traditional settings, but doing some courses in online courses.
One or more courses online. So it could be a student in a brick and mortar environment that's simply taking, say, one course from the Electronic High School of Utah, or it could be someone from, say, the Open High School of Utah that's taking their entire curriculum online. The full ones, so the full-time ones, which are mostly cyber charter schools, you're looking at probably, Watson in 2010 put it at 275,000, and indicated at the time it was the fastest growing segment of it. I haven't seen any numbers since then, but just looking at what's been happening legislatively across the country and just the number of cyber charters that have increased, I would probably peg that close to about 400,000 now. So of that, if you use the DOE's numbers, 1.7 million, about 25% of them are doing their entire curriculum online, the other 75% are doing supplemental. So we've got all this stuff coming out, and interestingly, the vast majority of it is actually coming out by people who are something other than educators. So if you look at sort of the big books that everyone knows, Disrupting Class is the main one. It's 3 Harvard School of Business professors, because the business school really knows what constitutes good education. Even more so, you've got, Moe and Chubbs, Terry Moe and John Chubbs, 2 political science professors, because, the political science department are the bastion of, pedagogical excellence in most universities. And this goes on and on, Paul Patterson, Paul Peterson, Saving Schools, is a historian. When you look at the people that are out there pushing these things, even within the ones that are running a lot of professional organizations, you find very few educators that are actually involved. Most of these people are coming from a corporate background, or at least something that has more of a neoliberal philosophy behind it. So when we look at the research, in all honesty, the vast majority of research today, when you look at just percentage-wise, has been based upon this idea, our students learn. Comparative research between the online class and the face-to-face class. And, in a program in instructional technology, all you've got to do is go back to, sort of Clark's seminal 1983 piece and say, well, first of all, there's many, many methodological flaws in that. But even when we look at the actual research that's being conducted within the K-12 environment, it's interesting. I just pulled out 4 from the past decade here. And, we're all sort of guilty of doing these things, because you'll notice that I do this on purpose. 2 of those 4 studies that I've conducted. But when we look at these, most of them have tended to say that online students do as well or better than. And that tends to be the predominant narrative. And if you ever listen to Susan Patrick at INAPL, that's one of the lines that she has in just about every single one of her speeches. Online learning is as good as or better than face-to-face learning. And then she'll continue to say that blended learning is even better than that. And when we look at, how this sort of shakes out, one of the things I always come back to, everyone here familiar with John Hattie's work? Or I should say, anyone here not familiar with John Hattie's work? Okay. Hattie, this is a book, and he's got a subsequent one now that's called Visible Learning for Teachers. It's got a blue cover. This is a book that should be on the bookshelf of every single educator, regardless of what level. John Hattie was a faculty member at the University of Auckland. He's at the University of Melbourne now. Essentially what he's done over the past 12 years, he's had a team of, actually mostly graduates, that have gone out and found every single meta-analysis that they could find that looks at different factors that influence student learning. And they've come up with, at last count, they had 867 that were included in there. And they grouped these based upon like factors and then perform an analysis called metasynthesis. For those of you that aren't familiar with the meta-analysis, the meta-analysis basically takes all these individual studies, like the ones I had on the previous slide, and combines them to come up with what they call an effect size. I always refer to it as a super result. So they take all the individual results, combine them, and come up with a super result. Well, what a metasynthesis does is it takes all these super results and then combines all of those to come up with, I don't know, a ginormous result or something. You know, super result, or super result squared or something. But the idea is essentially this notion that one of the things that a lot of comparative research, one of the flaws of a lot of comparative research is the idea that it's context-based, or you're looking at limited sample sizes, or if I'm working with a sample in Kansas, that might not be necessarily the same as a sample in Colorado. You know, but if you combine all of these samples together, you start to wipe out some of these individual sample problems, or sample specific things. And he has this notion, you can see all these little, for lack of a better term, kind of speedometer type things that he's got here. And based upon the research that he's conducted, and this actually is well supported by the work of Gene Glass, who was one of the scholars that were sort of at the forefront of this meta-analysis movement. Essentially what happens is when you look at these effect sizes, so when you're looking at the results of a meta-analysis, not necessarily meta-synthesis, but just that meta-analysis, the average individual will essentially move approximately 0.15 from developmental effects in a typical year. So essentially a kid sitting in a classroom, just getting a year older and a year wiser, you guys for example, between now and if I were to come back here in February of next year, would essentially increase whatever assessment I gave you, approximately 0.15, just because you've gotten a year older, a year wiser, and exposed to a bunch of other things, and you become more mature and that kind of stuff. Right? The average teacher will have an effect size of about 0.25. Right? So not a good teacher, just an average teacher. So a student sitting in the classroom of an average teacher, and so like if you're in Rick's class, for example.
Actually, I think that's a compliment.
Rick is not an average teacher.
So if you sat in Rick's class for a year, you would actually increase 0.4, regardless, if we're a good student, bad student, anything like that. Regardless if you did anything innovative or not. So what Hattie argues is that when we look at these meta-analysis and we examine these different treatments that we're looking at, we want to find something that's 0.4 or higher before we even start to consider whether or not this is something that we should adopt. 0.4 is actually a very liberal number. Glass, who was one of the, one of the founders of this meta-analysis movement, actually argues that it should be 0.6 or 0.8 before we actually consider investing time, money, energy into it. What's interesting is when you look at the three meta-analyses that have been done with K-12 online learning, well, the results don't look all that good. First of all, the first one that Kathy did averages out to the average developmental size. Now that's K-12 distance ed. Actually, only 2 of her 16 studies were actually online. The rest were traditional distance ed formats, audio graphics or correspondence for the most part. The one that she did as a follow-up as part of the NECRO, North Central Regional Educational Lab funded project, actually found that, and these were all online courses, that online learning actually made the kids dumber. They actually lost ground in what they would have had they been in the average class of the class of an average teacher for a year. Probably the most extensive one and one of the most rigorous ones was one that Barb Means did as part of the SRA International group. That was the US DOE one that came out in 2009. 46 studies, 5 of which were focused upon K-12. Found, at least for the K-12 numbers, it was 0.25, so again, an average teacher, roughly. They found that the blended learning ones, although none of these included any of the K-12 studies, so the blended learning were all higher ed studies, found a 0.35 effect size. This is actually what Susan uses, the US DOE study, when she talks about online learning is better and blended learning is even better than that. Well, actually, no. Sitting in the class of an average teacher for a year would have been better than both of those things. Go ahead, Chelsea.
Well, if these are comparisons, wouldn't these be above and beyond whatever the average sitting in the class is? Because this is these are the effect size comparing with face-to-face, right? So saying 0.24, if the effect size in a traditional face-to-face class is 0.25, then what this really is saying is that we're at 0.5. or is there some misunderstanding to my logic there?
You're looking at baseline data is what you're looking at here. So each of these are looking at where you would be and then where they were after they did the experience. So in most instances, what's happening is that they're just comparing to a one-time testing in the face-to-face classroom and a one-time testing in the online classroom. So it's a single point in time. So you're not looking at growth. You're thinking in terms of growth. You know, if they're both if I'm in an online class and this guy's in a face-to-face class, and we're both going to grow 0.4 throughout the course of the year because of that, and then I can add this on top of it, then it's going to help. That's actually not how these statistics are calculated. They're calculated at one point in time that if I were to spend a year in this environment, this is what would happen.
But the numbers here, for example, in the mean study, are not comparing against what would happen if they weren't in a class at all. It's comparing against what would happen in a class with an average teacher or something to that effect, right?
In theory, they're comparing to the students that are actually in an average class.
Right.
So again, it's not that add-on thing, we're comparing here to here. So it allows that third comparison. I know, I've actually sat down with John to try to get him to explain this to me. I'm a qualitative researcher, or at least I shouldn't say qualitative. Most of the questions that I ask these days tend to be qualitative in nature. Plus, my statistical knowledge was never at the level that reaches this. But I've sat down with John in Auckland, and yeah, I mean, he's explained it to me, and the way he's explained it to me is it's not the add-on that I was thinking, which is what you were asking about there, that it's a point in time. So that's the best I can give you at this point. He is very good at answering his email, though. I know that because he responds to me all the time. One of the difficulties beyond this idea of looking at the, just that strike comparison is, again, going back to this notion of sample. All of the studies that have been done, at least in the research body to date, have focused upon supplemental students. There isn't a single peer-reviewed journal article out there that does a comparative analysis of full-time students. There's literature out there, but on top of that, so. But there's no peer-reviewed journal article, there's no research reports that have focused upon those kinds of things. So when you're looking at the supplemental students, we start to notice some things about the samples, and these were two of the NECRO-funded studies. Bob Blumeyer, when he was still with the North Regional Central Educational Lab, which became Learning Point Associates, which became AIR. I can't remember what AIR is now. American something for Research Institute or institution or something. But one of those regional RELs that they've got set up around the country. Funded, I think it was 9 quantitative studies that looked at various aspects of online learning, and one of them was led by Kathy Kavanaugh, the other one was led by, I think it's Joan McLeod. They were both looking at Florida Virtual School, both comparing student performance, and this was really the first time in the literature where we started to see, anyone know it? I don't own a cell phone. So if you know of a way of actually turning this, I mean, I'm assuming it's like an iPad, I can just hold down on the top. This is Abby's.
Abby's. Yeah.
Yeah, I can just hold it, okay, good. Perfect, I think I just did it. You hold down on top and slide it over? Perfect. All right. I love it. Technology guy that doesn't own a cell phone. As I walk in, I pull out the iPad, the computer, the iTouch. I've got enough devices as it is. And everywhere you go, you've got Wi-Fi, so why do I need a cell phone? That way you get interrupted in meetings like this when you don't want to be. You can't do that with me because I don't have a cell phone.
But you have somebody else's cell phone.
Yeah, I know.
Vicariously.
Yeah. So, but these really were the first ones that started to question the notion of, who are we really looking at here, and are we comparing apples to apples? And it seemed to be, in all honesty, a logical thing, because when you look at the descriptors that we've always had for these supplemental online students, these are not the typical students that tended to end up in this environment. And it makes a lot of sense, because if you look at it, most of the early online learning, and even still now, a lot of the supplemental online learning, are targeted for advanced placement classes, second language courses, other areas where we have difficulty getting highly qualified teachers to go out into these rural areas. Now, there's a growing number in the last 3 years of credit recovery students that are starting to join in. But when you look at, if we assume that the 400,000 number is the number of full-time students, and there's roughly 1.7 million, of the 1.3 million supplemental students that are left, the credit recovery folks, even now, are probably only making up maybe 300,000 of that group, so less than 25% of that group. Yes, Terry?
So can I just clarify, what you're talking about really here is online learning, not distance, K-12 distance education?
Well, since basically roughly 2000, it's always been online
Right.
learning. Prior to that, it's, with the exception of the Clark, sort of the Cosmo Esposito stuff, which is the Virtual High School Global Consortium, which was one of the first, any sort of thing that's there before with a 1990s or earlier date, they're talking distance ed.
Because there's probably a lot of K-12 credit recovery programs that could be classified as distance because they're doing packets or they're doing, those kinds of things. Is that accurate?
No. In all honesty, very rarely. Utah is one of the few areas where you still see a lot of that happening.
Okay.
With EHS, where they still have a very strong correspondence-based model, you're one of the few states that still has that. Once you leave the U.S., it is much more common. I do a lot of work in New Zealand, for example, and the vast majority of distance ed that happens in New Zealand is still done by the correspondence school, and still done roughly in the exact same way that they did when they started back in 1922. With mailing out the packets to the kids, they mail them back. 6 weeks later, the kid gets some feedback and a grade. But I always like the Margaret and Bill's one here. Highly motivated, self-directed, self-disciplined, independent learner, who read and write well, and who also has a strong interest in or ability with technology. Sounds like your typical K-12 student. Right? You start to ask yourself some real basic questions. If that kind of student is only doing as well or a little bit better than the average classroom-based student, which contains a whole range of student abilities, what kind of crappy online learning have we been delivering to these kids for the past decade? They can only do as well as. And when we get, so basically the literature, at least what we've seen, suggests that, this young lady tends to be most of the people that are enrolled in online learning. Unfortunately, most of our student population in the K-12 level resembles more like this young lady. And, and a growing segment of our online learning students are in this. Most of our full-time online learning students, if you believe the excuses put forth by the companies providing these cyber charter schools, most of their population are like these young ladies, like this young lady. That's not necessarily the case. Speaking of those full-time groups, I mentioned there's no peer-reviewed literature on it, peer-reviewed research on it. One of the nice things about these guys is because it's become a political issue, we've got a lot of legislators that are looking at this. And right now, they're actually the best evidence that we have as to whether or not the students are actually learning in this environment. So if we look, I put a selection of them up here and some of the findings that they've had. But you're looking at Pennsylvania, Colorado, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Arizona, that have all done extensive legislative reviews of full-time performance in their state. Gary Murin at the University of West Michigan actually went through and looked at the performance of the K-12 Inc. schools in each of the states that they look at and compared their performance to whatever the statewide average was, trying to break it down based upon the demographic subgroups that are collected in that state, and found that the K-12 schools met AYP about 25 to 33% of the time, depending on the state, whereas the state averages tended to be between 55 and 63%. So they're doing about a half as well, or a third as well, as what they would be doing in the traditional environment. K-12 will always tell you, well, that's because the students that come to us, well, they're so far behind. I just read an article this morning in Pennsylvania where the principal of the K-12 school was saying, yeah, these kids, some of them are 8 and 9 and 10 years behind when they come to us in high school. One of the things that Murin found in his analysis is they enroll a lower percentage of special needs students. They enroll a lower percentage of students that receive free and reduced lunch. They enroll a higher percentage of gifted students. Right? So again, their sample, regardless of what they will tell you in the media, is more skewed to the higher end than what the traditional classroom sample is. Yet they're performing at lower levels. So, I mean, the question that we have to ask, and this is where sort of the research starts to look at, are these students really learning in this environment? And is this actually high quality learning? And the fact of the matter is, in most instances, it's not. If you look at a lot of the claims that these programs make, and I've talked about, what the proponents will say in the media, these are a lot of the things that they'll talk about. And I've put in parentheses behind them the effect size that Hattie found for each of these items when he did his metasynthesis work. And it's quite telling because, the three that you hear the most often is, that it's, it allows the student to personalize their own learning, allows them to individualize their instruction, and it allows them to take control of their own learning kind of thing. And if you look at those three, not perform all that well. Things like, being able to remove disruptive behavior from the class, doesn't do all that well. Charter schools in general don't do all that well. Having access to a teacher that has expertise in the subject matter doesn't make all that much difference. So those teachers unions, and this is a common thing in Canada in particular, that argue that a teacher is a teacher is a teacher, and that if you've got a good teacher that has strong pedagogical skills, that with a little bit of help, they can pretty much teach any content. The research kind of bears that out to a fair extent. The only one that you see that meets that 0.4 or higher mark is the second and third chance opportunities. But there's nothing special about the online environment for that. The traditional summer school that we used to offer is a second chance opportunity. So online really doesn't corner the market on that as well. So when you ask yourself, what is a lot of this about? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. It's about the almighty dollar and the ability to essentially privatize and make a profit off of the last public institution in the United States that really hasn't been touched. And what is happening is you've got an education system that is quickly becoming very much akin to the healthcare system that you have in the United States. In healthcare, those that have economic capital get one level of care, and those that don't get another level of care. In the case of education, it's not simply economic capital, it's economic, political, and social capital. But those that have it tend to get one level of education. If you can afford to live in a district where there are higher property taxes, the school gets funded at a lot higher. Even in poor areas, if you've got a group of parents that are very active in the school, you've got that social capital in the community. Those schools tend to be much better than, say, a lot of the schools around where I'm to, up in Detroit. And let's face it, politics and political capital will go a long way. That's one of the reasons why we see the proliferation of these schools. But those that don't have those things get another level of education, a second-class education. That's what we're seeing with a lot of these programs. So when we look at what it is we're trying to do, and when I look at the future of this field, what we need to figure out is, I'm a firm believer in the fact that online learning can be effective for every student. The question is how do we design, deliver, and support that online learning so each of those individual subgroups will be effective? We've done a pretty good job with the top end, with those AP kids. Right? Now, how do we change that model so the rest of the kids can actually have some success? And that's in my mind where the research should lie. And there's all kinds of variables that you can look at there. There's things in terms of the pedagogy that we do in online learning. There's how we design credit recovery courses compared to others. I know Jared has been doing some work with parental involvement. Because let's face it, if you've got a physical school to rally around, it's easier to get parents involved. If you've got parents all over the state with no physical presence, how do you get that parental involvement in the school to create that social capital that's going to make that school, be an effective organization? So there's a lot of opportunities in there, and unfortunately, right now there's only about a dozen or so of us that are actively researching in this area. It's so small, actually. Who's Jeff here?
He's
Jeff's
sick
not here?
today,
Oh, is he?
so-
I've been corresponding with Jeff through email, and it was so easy, actually, because I was able to just send him a list. Well, here's all the people that have published more than a single peer-reviewed article. And that's how small the community is. There's so few of us, so this area is ripe for research. So.
All right, pull up a chair, and
Let's
boy,
chat.
Michael's presented a provocative presentation here. What questions do you have for him?
And I'll leave that up there just in case people want to get a hold of me after the fact.
So why do you think there are so few? I mean, we can see that it's growing, and there's lots of questions that need answering, but why are so few?
Well, it's the Psych 101 thing. It's easier to do research on. I mean, how hard is it to develop
Yeah,
relationships
and I was
with those in
wondering,
high school?
yeah.
Much easier if you just study your own students, you're a professor.
And is it the barrier?
Well, that
between
plus,
the staff?
there's a lot of other factors that are going in there as well. You know, the number of new faculty members that are being hired has decreased. So a lot of the folks that, you know, like yourselves, for example, you know, those of you that are looking for a career in higher education, it's a tough market and has been for the last 4 or 5 years. You know, fewer institutions are hiring as people are retiring. A lot of universities are seeing this as a way of, you know, cutting costs. So, you know, the folks that, you know, are doing doctoral work in this area are finding that they can't find at least a full-time academic position, and they can piece together a whack of adjunct positions, but that doesn't give you any time to do research. You know, so we're not doing as good a job as creating the next generation of researchers within at least our area anyway. Although I think it is telling that, you know, the list, like for example, that I sent to Jeff, over half of them are assistant professors, you know, which I think is a good sign.
What are the barriers that you found trying to conduct research?
Well, probably the biggest for me has been my own IRB office. But that's largely in part, and in all honesty, I've dealt with IRBs at 7 different U.S. institutions, 3 New Zealand ones, 2 Australian ones, and 5 Canadian ones, and the Wayne State one is by far the worst one. We have a 26-page form that we have to fill out. And then in addition to that, they expect a 2 to 4 page proposal on top of that. Apparently we've got this accreditation, it's AARHPP or something. It's basically the gold standard for ethical review things. And because of that, not only do we have to follow the federal regulations, but in order to maintain that little gold symbol that shows up on our website, and I think that's the only value that it has in my opinion, we've got to go above and beyond what the federal regulations are. So for example, federal regulations say that I can recruit my own students. I have to set it up in such a way that I don't collect any data until grades are submitted. I can have it set up where I can get a GRA to actually do, you know, the actual consent process, much the same way we do student evaluations and teaching. I can't do that at Wayne State. I can't, you know, Rick's idea that Psych 101, I can't do research with my own students at Wayne State. It's next to impossible for me to do it myself. I can work with a colleague, and I can research his students, and he can research my students. And, you know, at the end, once the data's de-identified, we can share. But I can't research my own students, because that's apparently something that's in this accreditation. So that's been my biggest barrier, in all honesty. And other than time, that would really be the only barrier that I can honestly say has been an issue for me.
What about administrators? Do you find that administrators are concerned that, you know, you'll find that their school isn't as effective as they like to think it is?
No, but part of that is largely in part because most of the research that I've conducted in the last 2 or 3 years has more, it hasn't been things that I'm interested in, and I go try to find an administrator that wants to look at that. I usually go to the administrator, or in a lot of cases they come to me, and they've got problems, they've got challenges, they've got things that they want to get figured out. My biggest difficulty is how do I find time in the day to try to, you know, design studies that will address all of those areas. You know, and if you're answering their questions, they're not worried about what your results are going to be, because, you know, you're helping them. If you're going with your questions to them, then yeah, I mean, you know, no one likes, you know, to have the curtain pulled back, especially when you're exposed, kind of thing. You know, but if you're going to answer their questions, I'm more than happy to have you involved.
It's a good strategy.
Are there any studies that you're aware of that are looking inside some of these large, like the K-12, you know, .com models or other more corporate-driven K-12 online models, or are those pretty much shielded from
K-12
research that's going right now?
basically will not cooperate with any research unless they get to control it. And by control, I mean edit. So the last study I know of that was done by an outsider was done by Greg Kearsley and Bob Blumeyer. And K-12 highlights it as an independent evaluation, but I've seen the original draft that Bob submitted, and I've seen the draft that K-12 put up on their website, and you'd swear it was two different studies, in terms of how they've done it. Now, K-12, I mean, I do pick on them, and I pick on them for good reason. I mean, they are the big guy on the block, and they act like most corporate giants do. I mean, they act much the same like Microsoft did when, they're trying to kill WordPerfect, to be perfectly honest with you. But, I mean, not all of the programs are like that. I have a great deal of respect for the folks at Connections Academy. I've done work with them in the past. I've even sat on the board of one of their charter schools. And in all honesty, it's the only company that existed at the time that I would have considered doing that for. They've always been very open to having research done on them. And have the experience I've had with them, they've exercised very little editorial control whatsoever. So it depends upon the company. In terms of the work that's actually being done, Gary Murin is probably the only one who's been doing much work in this area, and that's for the National Education Policy Center. He's actually been looking at, over the last, I think it's the 13th or 14th report now, where they go through and look on a state-by-state basis how charter schools do versus public schools in terms of meeting AYP in the various subgroups. And 2 years ago, he started adding in online charters as a variable into that. And then, I think it was about this time last year, actually, he actually released a study that specifically looked at K-12 Inc. and went out and tried to actually get the contracts that they had signed with all the different school districts, looking at, what were the regulatory requirements. And that in and of itself is interesting, because in theory, if a school district enters into a contract with an outside provider, a corporate provider, that is part of the public record. You should be able to access it under freedom of information. And anything that's mentioned in it in terms of reports generated should be able to be freedom of information. And Gary's got some wonderful stories. One in Maine or Massachusetts is a good example where, actually it's Massachusetts, where first the company and the school district wouldn't provide the agreement. They had to get it under freedom of information or access to information, which is the U.S. where it needs access to information. In it, it specifically said that there was a report that would be generated every single semester that talked about all the demographic breakdowns. They asked the district person this. The district person said, well, the report didn't exist. I've never seen one of these things before. They asked the company, and they said, oh yeah, we submit these every single semester, but it belongs to the district, so we can't give it to you. After I think it was 8 months of access to information requests, I think they had to file like 3 grievances on it. They finally got like 16 of these, looking at it essentially the last 3 or 4 years. But yet, and when they came back to the district chairperson, the superintendent, to ask her about it, she still claimed that they didn't exist. I mean, that's the nature of what we're dealing with, unfortunately, when it comes to a lot of these cyber charters.
Let's get some questions from.
The research is kind of sparse in many ways, and yet we have regulations or standards being set based on the research. What are your feelings about, because some government agencies and other organizations are looking at these standards and saying, that's the way it has to be. Do you feel like the research justifies that?
No. There are when you're looking at the standards, there are really kind of 2 things. Digital Learning Now released their 10 guidelines or 10 principles of digital learning, which is actually what got adopted in the legislation here in Utah. This is basically Jeb Bush's idea of corporate educational reform. It's the model that he instituted in Florida, and it's the model that he's been pushing through his the Foundation for Excellence in Education. I find a pejorative title for that. When you look at the actual standards that are out there, iNACOL has 3. They've got online course design standards, online teaching standards, and online program standards. None of those are based on research. Anyone who knows sort of how standards come about, there's a specific process to generating standards. The first thing you do is you go out and look at the research literature to see what's supported by that, by the research. You develop an initial list. You provide that list to a panel of experts asking them for their opinion based upon, you know, does this jive with what actually happens on the ground, or is this just ivory tower stuff or something? And usually you go back and forth a couple of times and you refine that list of standards. Then you take the standards, turn it into an instrument. I give you a copy, you a copy, you a copy. I tell you all to go out and observe the same thing and fill out the instrument. If you all fill it out in the same way, then yes, those standards are fairly reliable and they're valid. If you all fill it out differently, then, you know, we've got a useless instrument, which means the standards are useless in the first place. In the case of the INACO course design standards and teaching standards, they haven't gone through any of these three processes at all. They basically went in and looked to see, okay, who's got standards about online teaching or online course design already? And then, you know, let's cobble together our standards based upon that. They didn't have to do much cobbling, because what they did was they saw that the Southern Regional Educational Board had a set of standards out there. They added one standard to each of those two at the end, because at the time they did this, they were involved with this Partnership for 21st Century Learning Skills. So they added a standard at the bottom to associate with all of that. And then they posted it up there as national standards. They've never had a systematic research study. There's an instrument you've got there. There's a dissertation waiting to happen right there. You know, find yourself two or three reviewers. Get yourself a couple of, you know, asynchronous course content things, and, you know, have your reviewers go through and review them using INACO's instrument to see if there's any inter-rate or reliability at all. If there's not, start eliminating standards. If you want to have a really good dissertation that's going to take you into, say, the first 3 years of your career, go back and start at the beginning. Go back and actually look at the literature related to online teaching. You know, what is effective online teaching, and what is effective asynchronous course design. And for your dissertation, essentially do the, okay, let's create a list of literature-based, you know, research-based standards. And then your first study when you're a faculty member is, okay, now let's send this off to the review panel. And then, you know, you can usually get an article or two out of that, because it's got to go back and forth a couple of times, and then you do the actual validation of those things. In the case of the program standards, they did do a little bit better. They still didn't look at the literature, so none of them are research-based, but they did get a panel of virtual school and cyber school administrators to come together, as well as a couple of evaluators, and generate that list. So they went to step 2, they skipped step 1. Step 3 has still never been done on any of them.
So what concerns would you have about the future direction of the actual implementation of these online models or whatever, if they're based on standards that haven't been through?
Well, I mean, it's like most things governments do. You know, I mean, you've got a bunch of people in there that know nothing about the sectors that they're actually, you know, legislating about. And I mean, regardless if it's a set of standards that they're making ill-informed decisions on, or if it's just, you know, their own little whimsical decisions. You know, I mean, they're going to make, unfortunately, and in the U.S., we've actually exacerbated this problem by most states have introduced term limits. So anybody who actually gets good at their job and starts understanding the sectors that they're actually legislating about, well, all of a sudden, now they're not allowed to run anymore because they've already been in there for 2 or 3 terms. You know, so we got a whole bunch of new yahoos in there that we've got to break in, and by the time we get them any good, they're term limited out. You know, so in all honesty, I don't think it makes that much difference. Legislators make bad decisions about what they, you know, I mean, I always use the Canadian example. If you look at ministers of education at the provincial level of our 10 provinces and 3 territories, since 1970, there have been 3 teachers to hold that position of the 137 ministers of education we've had during that time. You know, and I come from a province where, you know, 60% of our legislatures historically have been teachers. Why we've only had 2 ministers of education that have actually had an education degree, I have no idea. But, I mean, that's the case. I mean, you get, you know, a bunch of, you know, businessmen and lawyers. Yeah, Charles?
So, you painted a picture that looks kind of bleak for right now. I mean, you know, I know that you know, your belief, you stated pretty strongly that your belief is that this can be done well, but much of what we're seeing is maybe not being done well right now, or at least we don't have evidence for that. We don't have strong evidence for that. Could you help us understand what you think the most important directions in research are to help? I mean, obviously, there is hype around K-12 distance education, but it's also meeting the needs of a lot of people too. I mean, I have children who have taken online courses, and it's helped them to meet the goals that they have for their education. Now, they are the, you know, that
The
top
percent, yeah.
top tier of students, but I just want to know what you think those essential things are that we should be researching and looking at to improve what is out there.
Can I add to this question?
Sure.
In your data, you combined then like asynchronous versus synchronous models and full-time versus enrichment students on one pot, is that right?
Kind of.
Because when you're combining metadata, that can happen, right?
Hattie does, yes, and his stuff. In all honesty, when you're looking at the U.S. situation, there's very few synchronous online learning happening at the K-12 level. And there's a very good reason for that. I mean, education is locally controlled in the U.S. So in Michigan, there are 586 school districts. If the Michigan Virtual School wanted to have synchronous as being part of what they did, they'd have to get 586 school districts to agree to a common timetable, a common start and finish time, a common recess. Now, you know, in Canada, we have an easy job with this. Education is controlled at the provincial level. You know, so the provinces that have province-wide programs, they set out a calendar that has a timetable on it, says if you want to participate, this is what your schedule is going to look like. And if you don't make your schedule look like this, well, you can't participate. You know, but because here, so the only program that had any sort of strong synchronous component at all was the Access Alabama program. In their first 2 years of operation, you could either take their entirely asynchronous version or you could take their video conferencing version. Now, after the first 2 years, they got rid of that because just the actual issues of getting around trying to schedule all that synchronous instruction wasn't happening. So there's very little synchronous instruction that happens at the K-12 level in the U.S. To answer your question, Charles, in all honesty, I always recommend to doctoral students I work with to look at the subgroups. You know, I mean, your kids, in all honesty, I'm going to give them a textbook and tell them that in May they're going to get an exam on it, and they're going to figure out a way of doing it okay. Right? And our top kids are going to do that. They're going to, you know, one of the reasons why they're at the top of that scale is because regardless of what kind of learning situation they've been put in, they've been able to figure out how do I learn well in this environment. What we need to do is look at those other students, you know, so looking at, say, the supplemental online credit recovery students. You know, where do we have programs where we're starting to see, you know, a lot of success happening there, and why is that success happening? You know, so, you know, looking at full-time online programs, or in some cases hybrid programs, and seeing, you know, what are they doing to have success? I've got two right in my neck of the woods, the St. Clair County RESA Virtual Learning Academy and the Westwood Cyber School. Both using very different models, both district-based programs that are full-time online programs that are having some wonderful success. You know, looking at, you know, what are they doing differently that, say, the K-12s of the world could learn. Although I think you've got to get rid of the corporation in order for that to work. You know, it was interesting because about a year and a half ago, actually it was 2 years ago, no, about a year and a half ago, the US DOE released an RFP to create a center for online learning students with disabilities. And it was, just to read the RFP itself was a fascinating read because this is a 15-page RFP that had a total of 37 citations in it that wanted to create, we're going to spend up to, I think it was $7 million over a 5-year period to create a center that was going to be focused upon how, you know, looking at researching online learning with special needs students. And the rationale behind this was because that online learning, you know, basically had such a great ability to cater to the needs of these students. And of those 37 citations that were in there, there wasn't one single piece of peer-reviewed research that actually supported the main thesis for creating this center in the first place. And if you actually have looked at the center's activities, Kansas State, I think Kansas State were the ones that got it. You know, but if you go and Google the center, you can actually go there, you look at their research activities. Again, they're producing that same kind of, you know, perception-based type things. You know, and they've been operating for over a year now. And they've produced no reliable, valid research to even support the premise of their existence. But yet, you know, we've got more and more special needs students, we've got more English language learners, we've got all kinds of, you know, low socioeconomic status students that are in this environment. And they're not succeeding. You know, when 35% of a school meets AYP, we know what 35% are actually meeting AYP. You know, it's the kids that would have made it regardless, or the kids that have such an active parent that they're standing over them while they're doing it. But in all honesty, that kid, even though they're a little bit slower, are still gonna have success anyway because of that parental involvement. You know, what do we do for those other 65%? And we can actually look at the demographic factors of those other 65% fairly easily. You know, and start pulling out those. So picking one of those subgroups and saying, okay, what can I do to make the lives of this group of students in this particular jurisdiction a little bit better?
The special needs, who are the researchers that are looking at that? I know Dr. Kavanaugh collaborated on one paper, but I haven't been able to find.
Eric Black's dissertation, he's published a couple of papers out of it, although they mostly appeared in medical education journals, looked at students that were homebound due to severe illness. So in a lot of cases they were, actually I know 2 of his 7 dissertation subjects were oncology kids. You know, that would literally go into, you know, get their chemotherapy, and then they're sick for the next 4 weeks, and after that they still, you know, there's that social stigma of going back to school because they don't have hair, and that, so they were involved in so those kinds of kids. So he's got a couple of articles out on that. Kathy came up with this 5C framework that they've done a couple of papers on. Her and Tom collaborated on an evaluation that they did with Missouri Learning Online. That I know at least 2 papers have come out. Feng Lui was one of the docents I worked with him on. It was the lead author, and it was in the electronic, the International Journal of E-Learning at AAC website. That came out. Other than that, I can't think of any off the top of my head, because these Kansas folks haven't produced anything yet. You know, I read all of their research notes that they put up on their blog, and I mean, you might as well have K-12 producing this for them.
We only have about 5 minutes left, so be thinking of your.
In relation to Charles's question, with the looking so bleak at the moment, what are some characteristics about online learning in K through 12 that makes it still worth looking into and researching that you've seen from your experience?
Well, to reframe your question a little bit, when I go and talk with legislatures about, you know, if I were creating a legislative regime that would set up, that would be designed to set up effective online learning programs, what would it look like? I'm a big believer in managed growth option. You know, so these ideas of limiting the level of enrollment, particularly in the early stages of the program, I think are very useful. You know, because it's the same as any school. I mean, if you have a school that has 100 kids today and 1,000 kids tomorrow, you know, there's going to be problems. It's true of any business. You know, if I've got 10 customers today and I've got 150 walk through the door tomorrow, so, you know, if you look at jurisdictions where you've only been able to, like Michigan was one initially, where you're able to enroll 400 students in your first year. They were allowed to enroll another 1,000 in their second year. You know, I tinker with the numbers a bit, but you know, I see that as a good thing. I see a lot of district-based programs that are doing some wonderful things, even in the full-time aspect, because the big difference between the district-based ones and the statewide cyber charters is the district sits down and says, okay, we've got this group of students that are failing, whatever this group is. How do we design an online program that's going to cater to the needs of this group of students? You know, so it's very targeted in what they're doing. Whereas the K-12 Incs. of the world, they create a program that, you know, okay, we've got this one database that all the curriculum gets pulled from. The student does a pretest to figure out what they know. And then we're going to give them this nice, well-designed multimedia instruction based upon the stuff that they don't know. The teacher is primarily a tutor and a grader. You know, there's not a lot of instruction that actually happens. It's mostly on demand to, you know, tutorial services, and then they grade things that aren't graded by the system. And the parent, who is the role of the learning coach, is the primary instructional person in that environment. That's a single-size model. The only difference is that the smarter kids do a little bit less of the curriculum because they do a little bit better on that pretest. Right? That's why it fails. I mean, if I walk into my face-to-face classroom and teach one way every day, all year long, one group of kids are gonna do well and the rest of them are gonna fail. And that's what we're seeing in the statewide programs. So looking at that more targeted approach, and in all honesty, that usually means smaller, more geographically focused. And I guess the corollary to that would be the fact that, those smaller, more focused programs actually are designed around what the learner's specific needs are. If you've got programs that look like that, and this is why I think, online learning is not going away. I mean, hopefully, one of these days we'll drive K-12 Inc. into the ground. But in all honesty, looking at the dominant ideology that I see in your politics, that's not going to happen. There's a reason why in Canada, we only have one jurisdiction that allows charter schools, and there's not a single online charter there, and even people within the charter school movement there couldn't fathom the idea of an online charter. Whereas here, I mean, that seems to be the way to go, because it's the way to maximize profits. Just a different ideology that's done. I don't know if that answers your question though.
And then they would pull state schools as well as district schools, the big mega charters with the district ones.
Yeah, so when I look at like St. Clair, who, the kid, in order to be eligible for St. Clair school, you have to be excluded from a face-to-face school. Most of these kids actually come to St. Clair's virtual academy right out of juvenile detention, some of them right out of prison. So I mean, these are, not the best of students that we're working with here. They have an 86% graduation rate. Show me any statewide supplement or statewide cyber charter that's got even a 50% graduation rate. But they've got a really useful hybrid-based model. Odyssey Charter School in Las Vegas, Nevada. Again, another primarily online, hybrid program that is having some wonderful success. And Clark County School District, there, I mean, they're among the worst in the country. When you look at LA United, DC, Detroit Public Schools, DC Public Schools, and Clark County. And there's sort of 4 or 5 worst school districts in the state, or sorry, in the U.S. And they're having great success at Odyssey.
So wouldn't it be fair to say a program like K-12, it's not necessarily K-12 that's bad, it's districts that are using K-12 as their single solution, which K-12 might be.
Well, I mean, but that's the model that they have. I mean, like in theory, I could be a school district and I can contract to use K-12's curriculum in my program, but still run my own, online school. That's not happening in most laws. There are a lot of instances of that happening. But when we look at their schools, and this is part of the problem, for those of you that aren't familiar with how these cyber charters operate, essentially you get a board of local parents, and by local it could be across the state, parents, community leaders, that kind of thing, that come together. They basically contract with K-12 Inc. or with Connections to operate all aspects of the school. And we are going to do that based upon, whatever, we, like in Michigan, when I was on the board, we were allowed 400 students, so we knew we could get up to 400 FTEs. So we figured out how much money that was, built a contract, that was based on our grading scale, for that, and then handed the whole operation over to them. They hired the principal, they hired all the teachers, they do all the exam invigilation. My role as a charter board member, as the person in the state that's responsible for overseeing this, is basically to show up to 1 2-hour meeting a month where I listen to Connections, tell me all the things that they're doing, and then ask my permission to do a bunch of other things, and that's basically it. That's the only oversight I had of this charter school. It was like, the example I always use, it was the same thing as if we contracted Walmart or McDonald's to go run a school for us. And the nature of the thinking, that bottom line thinking, and the fast food industry is actually a very good comparison, because you can have your Big Mac however you want it, with pickles, without pickles, with extra mac sauce, whatever, but a Big Mac is still standard across, regardless if you're in Utah or Colorado or Canada or Russia, and that's the same kind of thing. The Big Mac is their curriculum. The service and the environment and everything else that comes through is basically the other aspects of the school. And while I have the ability to personalize, it's a standardized widget that I'm dealing with. But they run the whole show. And that's how these things operate. And that's the biggest problem. If we could actually change our charter school legislation so that it prevented for-profit corporations from coming and directly managing schools, that in and of itself would actually solve a lot of these problems. Because then it would force the boards to actually have more oversight and more involvement in the actual day-to-day decisions of what actually happens.
That's part of what instigated some of those suits against K-12.
Yeah, well, the biggest one in Wisconsin, and
Yeah.
it was actually the biggest problem was that the fact that in their instructional model, the learning coach is the main instructional person. In Wisconsin, like most states, you have to have a teaching certificate to be a teacher. So actually, in the end, even the State Department of Education were on the side of the teachers union in the final court case going against K-12 Inc. because, you know, the legislation simply didn't allow for this.
Wow, this has been a provocative, lot of questions come out of it. I hope Michael is very good about engaging with people outside of the classroom too. So I'm sure, I think he needs to go to meet a commitment
Yeah,
here
we've got the, I gotta go see the open school
at
folks.
Open High School. But if you have questions, I'm sure he'd
Got my
be
email address there?
welcome to answer those and continue to engage with you. And let's give him a round.